Hi and welcome. I'm preparing to go down to my wormery to tend to one of my worm bins, and that's the one that's listed here at the very end. It's my newest worm bin, which has now aged 10 days. And in that fairly short lifespan, it's already had a fairly significant event happen back here 3 days ago, which was when I had harvested these two bins up here and had relocated all of the worms from those two heavily populated bins into here, in addition to a bunch of worms that had already been placed in there 10 days ago. And after 10 days, especially with now this new injection of many more worms, it seemed like it was time to feed. So I'm on my way down there now, but I figured we'd start here and just check the game plan before we begin, just in case there's anything else that needs tending to. And I don't think anything else needs any maintenance or attention right now, so I think that's good. Let's go take care of that one bin. So now the bin we're going to be working on is the one you see down here at the bottom. It's got a lot of weight to it. It's got lots and lots of worms in it. And right here next to it is a bin that's only, a couple weeks older. And it had kind of fallen into a certain schedule, which I documented here. And I had created this the last time we visited in on that bin to add those worms, which was on day 7 when we added the worms. And today, since we're at day 10, and since I had told myself I'm going to try to manage these two bins in tandem with each other, since we are now at day 10, since that bin received its first feeding on day 10, bin over here on its 10th birthday is going to receive its first feeding as well. On my way down, I grabbed this whole bag of kitchen scraps out of my freezer, and it's a fairly large amount, so the worms are not getting everything that's in this bag. I'll just grab a handful or two when we're feeding them, and in combination with some of the kitchen scraps, I've got a number of other things over here on deck for the worms. One of them is this piece of really moldy bread, and this has been getting gradually added to most of my bins lately, a little portion at a time. Let me see how much of that I can try to get rid of today in today's feeding. As bedding, I've got a little container here with some shredded cardboard that we can lay down underneath our feeding zone. And over here on this side, we've got our staple food item, which is a container of used coffee. Quite a bit in here. I don't think we'll use all of it today, but we'll see how much of it we can dose out. And to top things off, we'll include some grit. All right, let's get to work. Usually when you think of a worm bin's first feeding, you're imagining a fairly light bin, not a lot of worms in it, not a lot of material or moisture, but in this case, we've got a little bit of an exception to the rule. Here we've got what started out as a fairly small, light bin. As of a couple days ago, became a very heavily populated bin. In some of the comments, I believe we had made guesses along the lines of maybe 4,000 or so worms in this little tray. There's no way to know for sure, but I trust that those estimates are probably pretty close. Seem pretty realistic if you watched the release videos. And there were 2 releases. The first release was 10 days ago when the bin was originally launched. And like we saw earlier, the second release happened only 3 days ago. And this bin is not very deep. I use a couple different types of bins, and this is the shallower type. So we don't have quite as much depth in this bin. And at some point we can always upgrade and move the contents of this into a deeper container. But for now I think we're still okay. This bin was originally built with food scattered throughout the bin. And when the new injection of worms came in, along with a lot of the food that they were inhabiting and squirming through at the time, came over too. And that was spread out pretty evenly across the top here too. So right now there's no one concentration of food in any one place where we might expect to see a big glob of worms. If we find worms, then we should probably expect to see them in a sort of consistent density throughout the entire bin. Oops. Oh, jeez. I just ejected a whole bunch of stuff, luckily right onto the cover paper. So saving those couple little worms was pretty easy. I'm glad they didn't end up on the floor. Sorry guys, pretty wild ride this morning for you. Alrighty, let's try not to do that again. I always like to see the progress that a very hard object like a mango seed makes in a bin. Eventually this thing will break down into these really fine fibers and it'll just vanish altogether over time. The feeding today, I believe we're going to administer right down the middle here. So I'm going to open up a cavity down through here to add the fresh food supply. And since it's our first real maintenance check on this bin to examine how things are progressing inside, I'm not quite sure what to expect, so it should be pretty interesting. I think I'll begin by trying to scrape off some of this material that covers the top. In doing so, I think I'll get a little bit of a better sense of what I've got going on here, what it is that came over with the worms when I bought the last batch of worms over. Obviously, a lot of these castings, I believe, came over at that time too, although a lot of them probably got produced here too as well over the past couple days. Now, didn't have to go very far beneath the surface to start encountering some fairly nice large numbers of worms hanging out right here in the middle. As I reach into it, it does feel almost like worms only. You know, you can kind of tell when you do that, when your fingers are running through a bunch of worms versus running through anything else. There's definitely a distinct difference. You can feel it on your fingertips. So there's definite large chunks of food in here, like this additional mango seed, which is definitely not as far along as the other one that we saw. And as I keep probing down into here, I can feel that the material down around here is already sort of bedding type materials, cardboard, paper, things of that nature. So I don't want to dig that up. I think that that's a good platform to base today's work on. We'll only go as far as that. Get these guys off to the side here. We'll only go as far as that layer. Maybe scooping out a couple handfuls of worms. But I think we're already starting to scoop out a bunch of bedding too in the process, so let's not do that. We'll leave the remainder of that bedding down there in the pit. And then we're just going to supplement that bedding with a nice fresh layer of this cardboard. So I'll start by sprinkling that along the bottom surface. And it's a fairly dry material. It'll definitely wick up moisture as time goes on. But I'm not going to worry about wetting it down right now because I think the moisture level in the bin is pretty good. And once we add some food items, as those food items, which are currently frozen, start to thaw, we'll definitely get a bunch of moisture that starts to come out of those materials as well. And the whole thing's going to be covered up with that sheet of plastic that we used to retain the moisture. So that too is just going to allow moisture from everywhere else in the bin to sort of recirculate down into here. And the same will happen with these extremely dry pieces of bread as well. Next time we come in here, these pieces of bread will hopefully be nice and soaked and damp so that the worms can start into it, and hopefully the mold is right up their alley. I think they're going to like that. Now before we add the fresh foods, I'm just going to drop in some of these older food items. A couple mango pits and the old stem of the pumpkin. The only other things I remember encountering here along the way was that banana stem right there. And maybe, you know, leaves, but other than that I couldn't really identify any other larger hunks of food while I was skimming the top. So yeah, let's get the fresh feeding into here. Now lately I've been trying to take all of my frozen materials and keep them really loose and broken up, and even large pieces I try to fragment them into smaller particles every time I add more material to my collection of frozen stuff that's in my freezer, but in this case, this hunk here has sort of a reinforcement. It's got a piece of paper towel kind of holding the whole thing together, and the whole thing's frozen solid. But you can tell there's a couple cucumbers in there. Once this thing starts to thaw out, the worms are going to go nuts for that. They're going to love those couple rotting cucumbers in there. I think there's room enough here for one more generous handful or two, like so. And it does seem like we've got a little bit of a density of more food here, perhaps a little less going around, so who knows, maybe we'll see more worms diving into this big hunk here the next time we come back. Although, you know, cucumbers don't last very long usually in a worm bin. They're a popular item. So I'm adding grit now. The grit is a coarse, fine coarse substance that the worms consume along with their regular nutrition to, not so much for the nutritional value, but more for the coarseness of it to help pulverize the food in their gizzards. So that's the grit that I use, is fine pulverized eggshell. And this thing's got quite a bit in it, so I've just dumped out about half. That seems to be a good amount to cover up with here. It's a nice cover of coffee. And I think to finish off, what I'm going to spread across the top is my other staple go-to bedding material, is just leaves. Scatter some leaves across the top here. And that's probably going to make for a really nice welcoming place for the worms to squirm into as well. They always seem to like the leaves. Here too, it's dry material, but it'll also hydrate and get moist in a fairly short period of time, so I'm not worried about it. Naturally, if at some point I sense that the moisture levels are becoming dangerously low, I'll add moisture. But I think that the really dry days of winter are behind us now, and eventually we're going to get back to a nice humid summer, which the worms will like both for the temperature and for the moisture levels. So that's where we stand today. We've got ourselves a feeding zone, so what do we need? Yeah, you guessed it. We're going to follow tradition, and we're going to use one of our coffee filters to indicate that the feeding happened right here in the middle. So right here it's quite obvious to see that, but you know, it isn't always that way. So it's a good habit, I think, to indicate where you last fed, just as a little reminder to yourself. And wow, look at the level here. We did kind of disrupt things, and we excavated. We did, I think, raise the overall level throughout the bin. So we've got a lot of material in this bin. Hopefully these worms are going to start breaking it all down, making it a much more concentrated, condensed stuff. Make some room for more food. But like I said, if need be, we can always relocate these guys, get them into a larger space, so we can keep feeding them. All right, everyone, that's it for today. First feeding for my newest worm bin, which as of today is 10 days old and seems to be off to a really great start. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up, show that you liked the video, and also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. Hit the subscribe as well as the bell to receive notifications that there's been new content put online. There's always new stuff coming on, and there's always interesting dialogue happening in the comments. So thanks for keeping me company. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.